Now let's talk about the summary of the Middle Age Vikings. For this summary, the pages will go from slide 2 to slide 9, all by Max Harris. So for the summary, we'll be covering 5 main topics. Number 1 will be, who were they? Number 2, their Viking raids. Number 3, the Viking Age and their expansion into Europe. Number 4, the Viking ships. And number 5, the end of the Viking Age. So let's start off with who they were. The Vikings were Norse people from present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who from the late 8th to 11th centuries raided and traded from the northern European homelands across wide areas of Europe and explored westward to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. They were known for being a fierce and effective tribe when it came to battles. The Vikings were feared by many. The Vikings had played a major role in the northern Europe during the Middle Ages, especially during the Viking Age, which was from 800 CE to 1066 CE. Now let's talk about the Viking raids. The word Viking had actually been a translation in Old Horse that had meant to raid. The Vikings would board their long ships that were constructed out of wood and head across the water and search for villages to raid along the northern coast of Europe. This had included islands like Great Britain. The Vikings were known to attack monasteries because they were often defenseless, which allowed for an easy attack. However, this resulted in them to receive a bad reputation as barbarians. The Vikings hadn't cared for this. Monasteries were wealthy and undefended targets. Now I was talking about the Viking Age and their expansion into Europe. Initially, the Vikings had come from the lands of Scandinavia. But in the 9th century, they began to expand their settlement in places such as Great Britain, Germany, and Iceland. In the 10th century, they moved into northeastern Europe, including Russia. Vikings had been given the name Normandy when they had taken over France. Normandy had meant Northmen. As you look in this image, it reflects the transition of the Vikings and their settlement. By the start of the 11th century, the Vikings had reached their peak in expansion. One Viking in particular, named Leif Erikson, had reached North America. Leif had started a small settlement in present-day Canada. This had been several hundred years before the coming of Columbus. Now let's talk about the Viking ships. So first off, when you talk about Vikings, they're often famous for their massive horns, their helmets with horns, as well as their fierceness, but what they're mainly known for is their ships. The Vikings had 2 types of boats, the most famous being the long ships, which were used for traveling at high speed, and then this next one's known as the car. The car was a Viking ship used to travel and export goods. Now let's talk about the Viking longships. Longships were used for traveling at high speeds. Their sleek build allowed for them to cut through the water. They were mainly powered by the rowing of oars, but later on sails were put into aid to help them in windy conditions. Longships had a shallow draft, meaning that the boat stayed high above the water, which allowed for easy beach landings. Now let's talk about the Viking Nar ships. The Nar ships were designed and used for transporting cargo. The Nar was a wider and larger boat, allowing for it to carry more cargo. Now let's talk about the end of the Viking Age. In 1066 CE, the Vikings were finally defeated by the English king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, had led the Vikings into battle. The loss of this battle symbolizes the end of the Viking Age. After the loss of this battle, the Vikings stopped expanding their territory, and the raidings had become less frequent. Another factor that resulted in the end of the Viking Age was the coming of Christianity. With Scandinavia being converted into Christianity and becoming part of Europe, the Vikings had become a part of the mainland of Europe. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway's identities as countries began to form as well.